Good to see y'all again tonight. I didn't get much of a nap. I hope you did. But if you'll bear with me for the next few minutes, we're going to talk a little bit about something that sometimes people find unpleasant. What is one of the most difficult things for somebody to do? Probably to give up their money. It's tough, isn't it? You know, you ever been at home and somebody comes knocking on the door and you see them, they got a little pad in their hand, and you can see, like, maybe you even catch on the back side of the pad, they've got a little money pouch or something. You know what they're there for, right? They're collecting for something. And you're like, and if you're like me, you're like, oh, boy, here we go again. How do they keep finding my door, right? They're all the time asking for something. You're watching TV, or maybe you're on YouTube or whatever, and you get an ad that comes up. And of course, we're in election season right now, so you get a lot of stuff right now. Everybody running for something wants some of your money, right? They do. You give them money once, and they just keep asking you. I can tell you right now, I get probably, I'd say, somewhere in the neighborhood of 15 to 20 texts a day asking for some money. That's tough, right? But that's a reality of life. And the reality is that the church, the congregation here, we can't continue to operate if we don't have some sort of funds. We understand that, right? It doesn't work. I mean, imagine, if you will, if we just quit taking up collection on Sunday. How long would it be before we deplete whatever's in reserves right now? I don't know. But it would start going down, wouldn't it? And I know some of you here have kept books for organizations and for businesses and things like that, and you're very well aware of how it works. You got some going out and some coming in. And what happens when more goes out than comes in? It don't look so good, does it? This morning, we looked in Acts chapters 4, 5, and 6, and we noticed how that the Christians in Jerusalem, when the church was still very new and in its infancy, that it says that they were of one heart and one soul, and they gave as everyone had need. That's wonderful. That's a good thing. Then later on, we find in Scripture that Paul talks to the church at Corinth about this. In 1 Corinthians chapter 16, Paul writes to the church at Corinth, and he's talking to them about what he calls collection for the saints. Now, when you look through the book of Acts, you find that there was a time when Paul was sent with monies that was collected back to the poor saints in Judea, because they had experienced famine and difficulty and things like that. And so the Christians who were there in the area surrounding Jerusalem and in Judea, they were hurting. They were having difficulty. And so what the churches did, the congregations all throughout the world at that time, what they decided to do is, we're going to help alleviate or relieve their distress by collecting this money, and we're going to send it by Paul. And he's going to take it and he's going to give it to them, and it's going to help everybody out. Well, in 1 Corinthians chapter 16, beginning in verse 1, Paul says, "Now concerning the collection for the saints, as I have given orders to the churches of Galatia, so you must do also. On the first day of the week, let every one of you lay by in store," or let each one of you lay something aside, "storing as he may prosper, that there be no collections when I come. And when I come, whomever you appoint by your letters, I will send to bear your gift to Jerusalem. But if it is fitting that I go also, they will go with me." Now we know later they did go with him, and Paul did go with the gift. But you'll notice that Paul says he was collecting this for a reason. Now we know that in Jerusalem they collected the money. You remember this morning we looked at, they were laying it at the apostles' feet, and then later they had appointed the 7 men to oversee that work. So presumably it went from being laid at the apostles' feet to being given to those 7 men to distribute to the rest of the church as they had need, the widows and so forth. Well, here he's talking about collection for the saints. In the book of Galatians, chapter 6, I want you to notice Paul talks to the church at Galatia, and he says, beginning in verse 6, "Let him who is taught the word share in all good things with him who teaches. Do not be deceived. God is not mocked. For whatever a man sows, that he will also reap. For he who sows to his flesh will of the flesh reap corruption, but he who sows to the Spirit will of the Spirit reap eternal or everlasting life. And let us not grow weary while doing good, for in due season we shall reap if we do not lose heart." Now let's stop right there for a minute before we read that next verse. You'll notice he says, "Let him who is taught the word share in all good things with him who teaches the word." So at this point he's saying, he's talking about essentially supporting the preacher, right? That's what he's talking about, supporting those who teach. We know that in other passages he talks about those elders who are worthy of double honor, who work in the word. In the first century, it was not uncommon for certain elders to be paid by the church because they were essentially preaching elders, and that's all they did. They didn't do anything else. And so we see that that is a very real thing, but you'll notice when he says in verse 7, he says, "God's not mocked. Whatever a man sows, he shall also reap." And then he says, if he sows to the flesh, he'll of the flesh reap corruption, but if he sows to the Spirit, he'll reap eternal life or everlasting life. He said, don't give up in doing good. Well, what's he talking about? Well, he's just been talking about this idea of the sharing of our wealth with one another, right? That's what he's talking about. And then in verse 10, he says, "Therefore, as we have opportunity, let us do good unto all men, especially those of the household of faith." There is a movement that has existed in the church for a number of years. I don't know how long. It's been a long time. Y'all may even know some people who have been involved in that, which is called the non-cooperation movement. Now, they don't call it that. A lot of times we just call it what? The antis. Because they're anti-cooperation. They're anti-orphans homes, schools, and anti-this and anti-that, anti-Bible classes. And they come in all different flavors within the movement. There are some of these groups, non-cooperative groups, that they are okay with Bible class, but they're not okay with orphans' homes. They're okay with maybe a school, supporting a school, but they're not okay with having Bible class. And usually what goes along with it is they don't eat in the building either. That is anathema. Don't eat in the building. Oh, that's bad, right? But does the Bible actually bear that out? Is that a scriptural position? Well, no, he's just said here to the church at Galatia, as you have opportunity, do good unto all men, especially those who are of the household of faith. We look back in the first century, and we've just seen it in 1 Corinthians chapter 16, that they were collecting from the churches of Macedonia, from Corinth, and of course he says also the churches of Galatia, because remember he said, "As I've given orders to the churches of Galatia, so I also tell you." I don't know, folks, but it sure does sound like the church was cooperating, doesn't it? Various congregations all around that region were cooperating together. They were pooling their monies together to help the brethren in Judea. Definitely cooperative. Furthermore, you look at the missionary journeys of Paul. When Paul took his missionary journeys, what did he do? Well, he said to the churches, he says, "I've not robbed you. I've robbed others so that I could come and preach to you." He says, I've taken their money so you don't have to pay me. Yeah, that's cooperation. The church in Antioch sponsored Paul on these journeys. Turn, if you will, to 2 Corinthians. 2 Corinthians chapter 8. And we're going to look here for just a moment in 2 Corinthians 8 and 9. And we're going to notice a little bit more in depth about this giving that they were doing, this money that they were giving. He begins in chapter 8 and verse 1, talking about the church in Macedonia. He says, moreover, brethren, we make known to you the grace of God bestowed on the churches of Macedonia, that in a great trial of affliction, the abundance of their joy and their deep poverty abounded in the riches of their liberality. For I bear witness that according to their ability, yes, and beyond their ability, they were freely willing, imploring us with much urgency that we would receive the gift and the fellowship of the ministering to the saints. And not only as we had hoped, but they first gave themselves to the Lord and then to us by the will of God. So we urge Titus that as he had begun, so he would also complete this grace in you as well. But as you abound in everything, in faith, in speech, in knowledge, in all diligence, and in your love for us, see that you abound in this grace also. Notice here Paul talks to the church at Corinth here in his second letter. Remember in the first letter, in chapter 16, 1 and 2, he had commanded them to lay by and store. Now in his second letter, he's saying, hey, I want to point out to you, Macedonia, y'all know about Macedonia. Macedonia, though, they're poor out there. They don't have money, but what they have, they gave. Doesn't that kind of remind you of when Jesus was pointing out to his disciples about the widow and the two mites? You remember when Jesus was there with his disciples and they were observing people putting money into the collection at the temple? Now, as I understand it, the way that was done is they would have a big old pots out there, and the people would come along. I guess it's kind of like our cash box back there when we were doing that. But they had these big old pots, and as people would come into the temple, they would give their gift. They would just put it in. When, of course, as Jesus and his disciples were observing this, there were those who came and, in my mind, I'm thinking of, like maybe a very wealthy man comes and maybe he's got a small wagon behind him, pulled by one of his servants or something, and he starts, dipping it out in buckets. And that's just the way I see it. That's my envisioning of it. It might not have been like that at all. It might have been he took several gold pieces out of his pocket and just dropped them in. But whatever the point was, the idea was they were giving, as Jesus called it, of their superfluity. They were giving of their extra. They had done well in business, and they're like, well, we've got extra. You remember when Jesus talked about the rich fool? The rich fool of Luke chapter 16. And as he talked about the rich fool says, I have fared sumptuously. I've done very well. And so I've got all these things and I don't have barns to put them in. And what did he reason within himself? He says, well, I've got all this stuff. And I've got more than I've got room to hold it. Therefore, I'm going to tear down my little barns. I'm going to build bigger barns. And I'm going to store up all my stuff. And I'm going to say to myself, soul, take your ease. Eat, drink, and be merry. For you have stored up much for many, many years, is the idea that he's getting at. But then Jesus goes back again to that widow. As his disciples are observing, if you can imagine, this widow comes and presumably she's not well dressed. She's probably not wearing the fanciest clothes. And I can see her take those 2 mites, or do 2 pennies as some call it, but the 2 of the smallest denomination of coin that they would have had access to. So think if yourself, 2 pennies, all right? And they take them, and she puts those in. Most people would not have paid any attention to her at all, would they? They'd be like, she just put in two pennies. All right, 2 Corinthians chapter 8 again. He says in verse 7, he says, you abound in everything. He says, the Macedonians are like the poor widow. He says, you abound in everything. You Corinthians, you abound in everything. He says, you abound in faith, in speech, in knowledge, in diligence, in your love for us. He says, you've got all that down. He says, and you excel in everything of that. He says, I want you to excel in this too. I want you to be a giver as well. And Paul doesn't stop there because he continues to talk to them about it in chapter 9. For you'll notice in chapter 9, beginning in verse 6, he says, but this I say, he who sows sparingly will also reap sparingly, and he who sows bountifully will also reap bountifully. So let each one give as he purposes in his heart, not grudgingly or of necessity, for God loves a cheerful giver. And God, who is able to make all grace abound towards you, that you, always having all sufficiency in all things, may have an abundance for every good work. As it is written, he has dispersed abroad, he has given to the poor, his righteousness endures forever. Now may he who supplies seed to the sower and bread for food, supply and multiply the seed you have sown and increase the fruits of your righteousness, while you are enriched in everything for all liberality, which causes thanksgiving through us to God. Now you notice, it goes on in verse 12, he says, for the administration of this service not only supplies the needs of the saints, but also is abounding through many thanksgivings to God. And he's saying, I want you to be cheerful givers. It reminds me of when Samantha was young. I guess she would have been, maybe 5-ish, probably. She was a little one, probably about like Madden. And the collection plate was coming around, and we had given her some coins to put in. And so she was sitting there, and the collection plate came to her. Now, I'm going to tell you, Samantha was not one to just take the coins and drop them like that. Oh, no. Samantha wanted to put them in one at a time. Okay? So she was looking at her coins in her little hand. And she starts picking out the coins. She picks a penny and puts it in. She picks another penny and puts it in. And another penny and puts it in. Meanwhile, she has a nickel and some dimes and whatnot in her hand. And I was like, you need to put in all of it. That's what it's, you put all of it in. She said, I wanted to put in the best ones. She wanted to put in the shiny ones because they were the best ones. Because see, at her age, she didn't understand that the nickels and dimes were worth more. She wanted to give God the best ones. I'm going to tell you, I was a little bit humbled to hear that. Don't we want to give God our best ones? You remember under the Old Testament when God would command his people to give? They would give what they called the tithe. Now, of course, we're not commanded to tithe in the New Testament. Nowhere in the New Testament does it say give 10%. It doesn't say that. It says give as you've been prospered. It says give with liberality. Give as you purpose in your heart. And so all of these expressions indicate a free will. That is, we're not given a specific amount to give. But think about the Jews of old. They were told to give a tithe, a 10% of everything. So, if you raise sheep, what do? Well, you have your sheep pass under this thing, and here they go. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Bam, you're God's. Separated. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Bam, that one's God's. Separated, right? 10%. That's what they were doing. But God said not only were they to give every 10th one, but they were to give of the firstlings of the flock, the lambs without blemish, those that were the best. I want to encourage us tonight as we think about these things that we need to be giving our best as well. Now, yes, it reflects over here. It's just a number, right? And I know we all have better weeks and not as good weeks, right? Better months and not as good months. You know, and I know Candy can relate to this. There are times we just don't have work. It happens. If I were to be completely open with you, 2024 has not been my best year for making money. It hasn't. Have I starved? Well, you can look at me and tell I'm not starving. But it has not been my best. I've had better years. I don't know if I've had worse years, but I've had better years. It's not been that great. But the idea is whether we have the superfluity like the rich or the 2 mites like the widow, we still give. We give what we can. We give liberally. Because if you'll notice something that I kind of slipped over briefly there in 2 Corinthians chapter 8 and verse 4. You know, we've been talking about Wednesday nights, these past few Wednesday nights in Richard's class about fellowship. I want you to notice there in verse 4. It says that the Macedonians were imploring us with much urgency that we would receive the gift and what? The fellowship of the ministering to the saints. You realize when we give to God and we're giving our best and we're giving as we've prospered, we're giving cheerfully, we're giving liberally, we're in fellowship with one another and we're in fellowship with God. It's fellowship. Not all fellowship is fried chicken and you know, gravy and things, right? Some fellowship is giving. So I just want us to think about some of those things tonight. I know it's a probably a shorter lesson, and that's okay. Like I said, I didn't get my nap, so I don't have the stamina for a 45-minute lesson tonight, y'all. I just don't. And some of y'all say, "Thank you." Yes. Can't do it. So you just have to live with it. But one thing we can do, every last one of us, we can do like the Macedonians, even if we have absolutely zero money. Macedonians gave of themselves first. We can all do that. And that's where it starts. There's someone here tonight who has needed the invitation, whether to come to Christ for the first time, putting him on in baptism, or maybe coming back and giving yourself back to God. Don't wait. Let's do it tonight while we still can. Won't you come while together we stand and sing?